In my video comparing Baldur's Gate 3 to Pillars of Eternity, I spoke about the way Baldur's handles, or rather fumbles, its theme of nature versus nurture. I actually almost cut that section entirely, but the way that the game doesn't let you call out the Emperor for using his Mind Flayer nature as an excuse to be manipulative, doesn't let you bring up Omelum as a counterexample, and instead makes you accept his essentialist reasoning if you want to push back against him on several occasions, bugged me. And the theme reoccurred quite a bit in the game, so I decided to keep my take. But some great commenters caught a few things about how the Githyanki fit into the theme that I omitted either because I didn't think they were necessary to bring up, or I just forgot. The more I thought about them, the more I felt they were worth addressing in detail, because while I don't think my overall point about how the theme plays out is negated, it is more complicated than I made it out to be, and I genuinely want to be as fair to Baldur's Gate 3 as possible. It is one of my favorite games at the moment, after all. So let me clarify and refine my take on how Baldur's Gate 3 handles the theme of nature versus nurture. It is clear to me that Larian's intent was to convey the idea that your nature may be strong, but it doesn't define who you are. To come down against the idea of inherent overriding nature, especially for groups of people, which is a perspective that appeals to my own view on the nature versus nurture question. However, there are several instances that present nature as being overriding, while moments demonstrating the effects of nurture are smaller, more easily forgotten or ignored, or more out of the way to find. The moments advocating for nature are presented far more strongly. As a result, the apparently intended theme is mishandled. This is where the problem lies, in what I see to be the failure to effectively convey intent. But again, it's worth going into detail about the things I omitted, because I now feel my analysis is incomplete without them. Let's begin with the Githyanki Egg, the Gith who could become Pataris. In my earlier video, I focused exclusively on the outcome to that quest where you give the egg to the Society, because that is the route that most overtly continues the nature versus nurture narrative. If you use Speak with the Dead on one of Pataris' victims, the Society member who raised and tortured him says,
"Proving theory, genetic morality. I was right."
Your character can argue otherwise, but as I said before, it wouldn't be unreasonable to interpret Pataris' inflexible interpretation of the morality he was raised with as a quirk of his Githyanki nature. But that's not the only way the quest can resolve. After all, Lady Esther, who gives you the quest, gives real bad vibes. And in the current version of the game, Lae'zel urges you not to hand the egg to Esther as soon as you pick it up. You can keep the egg for yourself, and if you give it to Lae'zel, she will end up raising the Githyanki. Instead of Pataris, he will become Zon, named after the Gith word for his freedom to choose whatever life calls to him. While we don't see the results of Zon being raised in a more open kind of nurture, the intent is clearly one of hope, and of refutation that his nature will compel him to be any particular way. This feels like the sort of counterexample for nurture I previously said the game was lacking. Before patch 5, when I did my first playthrough, I did give up the egg because back then, keeping the egg resulted in nothing except unnecessary carry weight. There was no epilogue, no Zon, not even Lae'zel wanting to raise it. But now it is part of the game, just like Karlach slowly losing herself if she becomes a Mind Flayer, which I'd brought up before. So it is worth acknowledging, and it was an oversight on my part not to do so before. This outcome is still somewhat hidden. For one thing, the quest log doesn't suggest there are other outcomes beyond giving the egg to Lady Esther or ignoring the quest. It's not uncommon for RPGs to have hidden solutions, and it's fine to reward clever players for thinking outside the parameters presented to them, but only a fraction of players will do that unless they're using a guide. Furthermore, in order for this ending to trigger, the egg has to be in Lae'zel's inventory when the Netherbrain falls. If it's in another inventory, or in the camp chest because it weighs a lot, then this doesn't happen. So even if you keep the egg for Lae'zel to raise, if it's stored in the wrong spot, she doesn't. Apparently. This all means that the Zon resolution is more out of the way than the Pataris ending. One of the moments in the game that most strongly conveys the intended theme that your nature does not define who you are was not included at launch, is even now easily missed, and if you do get it, you get hope for the future instead of a clear counterexample to Lady Esther's judgments of Githyanki nature. Show don't tell is a common piece of writing advice, but it's not always true. Sometimes telling is more efficient, sometimes telling can be interesting because of how it is being told, sometimes it can inspire wonder in what is unseen and implied. But it is true that telling leaves less of an impact than showing, less of an impression in your memory. To some extent, it's the reason why the text-based storytelling of Pillars of Eternity is less immediately enticing than the fully animated Baldur's Gate 3. So the writing advice really is to be aware of this effect and know which parts of the story are necessary to show for maximum impact. When dealing with a complex theme that has two sides to it, and you show points for one side while telling points for the other, the side you show is going to, in effect, be favored, even if the intent is the opposite. That's what I feel happened here, especially with the Zahn ending being off-screen. An easier-to-see example of nurture would be the Githyanki youth Varl. In the creche, you can stumble onto a Githyanki training session in which the youth is being beaten for questioning the instructor having the trainees spar to the death. If you save him, he praises you for exhibiting compassion and kindness, and compares you to Orpheus. So clearly, he demonstrates both the brutal nurture that shapes most of the Githyanki warriors, as well as the fact that Githyanki are not all alike and they can be meeker, more compassionate. I almost brought him up in the original video, but didn't because I considered his role too small in the face of everything else. He exists to give you more details about Orpheus and is then completely forgotten. Orpheus himself is noble and willing to sacrifice himself if nobody else does, but he also exhibits a similar kind of inflexible dogma that we see in early game Lae'zel or post-massacre Pataris.
You may address me as your majesty. You should have yielded to them. They would have given you a noble end. Any worthy individual destined to become Geik would have done so.
Orpheus doesn't quite give the contrast I'm looking for. But back to Varl. His brief scene does convey a lot about how the cruel demeanor of Githyanki warriors is beaten into most of them. It is a glimpse into the Githyanki nurture not provided anywhere else, and is clearly meant to be an explanation. I felt that because we never see contrasting Githyanki nurture, except perhaps that given to Pataris, it did not disprove my central point. But it was a mistake to cut the mention I did have. At the very least, through Varl, the game makes it clear that Githyanki are not all brainwashed foot soldiers right out the eggshell, which does undermine Havkelag's assertion, however minimally. The existence of the Githzerai, who were pointed out by some commenters, is another moment where the counterexample to the power of nature is something more stated than shown, and therefore easier to forget or ignore. Cousins of the Githyanki living under a different creed and culture, this branch of Gith is mentioned a couple times, most notably in the Patch 5 epilogue if Lae'zel turns against Vlaakith. They are an entire alternate society of Gith, raised in a different culture with a different set of morals. A perfect refutation of what the Society of Brilliance says about Gith nature. It would have been cool to see them. I recognize that too much would bloat an already very long game, but maybe they could be helping Kithrak Voss free Orpheus in some way. After all, Orpheus and his loyalists are rebels within Githyanki society, not Githzerai. Seeing the contrast they provide for ourselves would go a long way towards exploring the nature versus nurture conflict. As they're represented now, it's unclear how different to the Githyanki they really are. In the epilogue, a passive history check tells you that the Githzerai are ruled by the immortal god king Zareth Mainyar Ag Gith. For someone not familiar with any differences that may exist in the Dungeons & Dragons sourcebooks, does this really make the Githzerai society seem so different from the Githyanki, ruled by their immortal god queen Vlaakith? More clarity on this matter would be nice. However, with all of that said, the way the Githyanki relate to the nature versus nurture theme is only really notable in the Pataris outcome of the Egg quest line. Otherwise, you likely will get the intended impression that it's Vlaakith's indoctrination that nurtures Githyanki into being so militaristic. I've been hyper-focusing on ways Githyanki nature and nurture are presented, but at the end of the day, this is just one component of the game's exploration of the debate, albeit the most blatant, and a small part of the game as a whole. If you don't look at the game through the lens of this particular theme, you likely won't even notice, especially if you never give the Society of Brilliance the egg, an outcome Lae'zel now explicitly suggests. I only thought to apply this perspective to the Githyanki because the Society do so, and seem to prove themselves right. That's basically all I wanted to say to complete my discussion of nature versus nurture in Baldur's Gate 3. I'm sure there are things I'll wish I'd have said as soon as I published this video, but
ain't that just the way?
Ever since the algorithm swept up the main video, I've been drafting like 5 different things at once. A lot of people wanted me to talk about Pathfinder Wrath of the Righteous, and there are 2 ideas I may have for that and just need to pick one. Or do both. We'll see, but either way, that'll take a while. I think I may want to do a big video about Dragon Age and Mass Effect to release around when Veilguard comes out. But until then, I have some smaller videos like this one I've been writing, and hopefully those will also be enjoyable. I think I'm done talking about Baldur's Gate 3 for a while. I don't want to get pigeonholed, but I'm not done playing it. Thanks for watching.